September 7th, 1945. Berlin, Germany. The war is over, but the air crackles with a different kind of tension. 4 Allied commanders sit side by side on a reviewing stand overlooking thousands of soldiers standing at attention. American General George S. Patton Jr., commander of the legendary Third Army, sits next to Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the man who captured Berlin. Around them, the ruins of Hitler's capital stretch for miles. The Nazi threat is gone. But on this parade ground, 2 military titans are about to engage in a confrontation that will reveal the real battle ahead. What happens next will silence one of the most decorated Soviet commanders in front of Allied witnesses and expose the fault line that will split the world for the next 46 years. This is the story of what Zhukov said when Patton threatened to fight the Soviets. A story of 2 warriors, 2 philosophies, 2 futures for the world. George Smith Patton Jr. stands at the height of his fame. He's led the Third Army across France faster than any force in military history. He's relieved Bastogne. He's crossed the Rhine. He's liberated concentration camps and pushed deep into Czechoslovakia. His soldiers worship him. His enemies fear him. His ivory-handled pistols and profanity are legendary. At 60 years old, he's everything a warrior is supposed to be. Tough, brilliant, and absolutely fearless. But Patton sees something his fellow commanders don't want to acknowledge. Throughout the spring and summer of 1945, as American forces push east through Germany, he watches the Soviets. He sees how they treat the territories they occupy. He witnesses the brutality in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in eastern Germany. He sees armies that won't go home, supply lines that keep growing instead of shrinking, a massive military force positioned not for peace, but for something else entirely. On July 21st, 1945, Patton wrote to his wife Beatrice from Berlin. The letter is blunt, almost desperate. "Berlin gave me the blues," he tells her. "We have destroyed what could have been a good race, and we are about to replace them with Mongolian savages." The language is harsh, reflecting the prejudices of his era, but the strategic concern underneath is deadly serious. Patton believes America and Britain have defeated the wrong enemy first. He thinks Nazi Germany, for all its evil, was at least fighting against Soviet expansion. Now there's nothing standing between Stalin's armies and the Atlantic Ocean except exhausted American and British forces that just want to go home. His superiors don't want to hear it. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, believes maintaining the alliance with Stalin is essential. President Harry Truman is focused on ending the war with Japan and bringing American boys home. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill shares Patton's concerns privately, but can't act on them publicly. Britain is broke, exhausted, and dependent on American support. Nobody wants to think about another war. The soldiers have fought enough. The people have suffered enough. Europe needs peace, not another crusade. But Patton can't let it go. In meetings with fellow commanders, he speaks openly about the Soviet threat. He tells anyone who will listen that the Third Army could defeat the remaining Soviet forces in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. He doesn't say this quietly. He doesn't hedge. He says it loud enough that his words reach Washington, loud enough that they reach Moscow, loud enough that they reach a certain Soviet marshal who doesn't appreciate being underestimated. Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov was 58 years old in September 1945. He's the most decorated commander in Soviet history. 4 times Hero of the Soviet Union. The man who saved Moscow in 1941 when the Germans were at the city gates. The man who crushed the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad, at Kursk, at Operation Bagration. The man whose armies surrounded Berlin and forced Hitler into his bunker. The man who accepted Germany's unconditional surrender on behalf of the Soviet Union. His troops have marched 2,000 miles from Moscow to Berlin. They've paid for every mile with blood. 27 million Soviet citizens dead. Whole villages erased. Cities reduced to rubble. They've suffered and sacrificed on a scale the Western Allies can barely comprehend. Zhukov is not a man given to idle boasting. He's a peasant's son who rose through the Red Army by being smarter, tougher, and more ruthless than everyone around him. He's survived Stalin's purges. He's survived battlefield disasters. He's survived the brutal politics of the Soviet High Command. He's learned that survival requires results, not excuses. When Zhukov promises victory, he delivers it. When he explains his tactics, he does so with a brutal honesty that shocks even hardened military men. Just months earlier, in a conversation with General Eisenhower, Zhukov described Soviet tactics for dealing with German minefields. Eisenhower asked how the Red Army handled mine-clearing operations. Zhukov's response was matter-of-fact, almost casual. There are two kinds of mines, he explained. One is the personnel mine and the other is the vehicular mine. When we come to a minefield, our infantry attacks exactly as if it were not there. Eisenhower was stunned into silence. What Zhukov described so calmly was a tactic of using soldiers' bodies to detonate mines, clearing the way for troops behind them. The Soviets had so many men that they could afford losses Western generals found unthinkable. They defeated Germany not just with tactics and courage, but with a willingness to accept casualties on an industrial scale. This is the man sitting next to Patton on September 7th, 1945. The parade itself is a display of Allied unity, at least on the surface. American, British, French, and Soviet forces march together through the ruined streets of Berlin. It's meant to show the world that the Allies remain united, that they'll govern Germany together, that the peace will be kept jointly. The reality everyone senses is different. Soviet troops control Eastern Germany and won't leave. Stalin has installed puppet governments in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. The Iron Curtain, though Churchill won't name it for another 6 months, is already descending. The reviewing stand holds representatives of all four Allied powers. Patton is there representing American forces. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery sits nearby. French representatives maintain their dignity despite France's limited role in Germany's defeat. And Zhukov, resplendent in his Soviet marshal's uniform, heavy with medals, represents the power that paid the highest price and now demands the highest reward. The parade begins. Formations march past. Equipment rolls by, tanks, artillery and infantry units in perfect step. For hours, the display continues, and then comes the moment that will define the day. Massive Soviet tanks rumble past the reviewing stand. These are not ordinary tanks, they're the latest models, heavy, powerful, equipped with long-range cannons. Zhukov, perhaps feeling the weight of Patton's public comments about defeating the Red Army in 6 weeks, decides to make a point. He leans toward Patton. His voice is conversational but loud enough for others nearby to hear. "My dear General Patton," Zhukov says, gesturing toward the passing tanks. "You see that tank? It carries a cannon which can throw a shell 7 miles. 7 miles. It's an impressive range, especially by 1945 standards." Zhukov is making clear that Soviet military technology is formidable, that the Red Army's equipment matches or exceeds anything the West possesses. It's a subtle reminder that dismissing Soviet military capability is a mistake. Perhaps it's also a subtle warning. Patton's been talking about fighting the Soviets. Here's a Soviet marshal reminding him what that fight would entail. The moment hangs in the air. Around them, other officers lean in slightly, sensing something significant happening. This isn't just military shop talk. This is a chess move, a test, a challenge disguised as casual conversation. Patton doesn't hesitate. He turns to Zhukov. His response is delivered with perfect calm, almost pleasant, the tone of a man discussing the weather. But every word carries weight. Indeed. Patton pauses just long enough for effect. "Well, my dear Marshal Zhukov, let me tell you this. If any of my gunners started firing at your people before they had closed to less than 700 yards, I'd have them court-martialed for cowardice. 700 yards. Not 7 miles. 700 yards. Patton has just told Zhukov, in front of Allied witnesses, that American forces wouldn't need long-range artillery. They'd wait until Soviet troops were practically on top of them, close enough to see their faces, close enough for killing to be personal and certain. It's an assertion of absolute tactical superiority. It says American forces are so good, so disciplined, so deadly that they wouldn't waste ammunition at long range. They'd wait until every shot counted, until every round found its target, until the battle became an execution." The silence that follows is profound. According to Pat Merle-Smith, who witnessed the exchange, it was the first time I saw a Russian commander stunned into silence. Zhukov, who commanded millions of men in the largest battles in human history, who stared down German panzers and Hitler's finest commanders, who survived Stalin's paranoia and battlefield catastrophes, has no response. The American general has just called his bluff and raised the stakes beyond anything Zhukov expected. It's not just what Patton said, it's what the statement reveals. Patton isn't intimidated by Soviet numbers or technology. He believes, truly believes, that American forces, with their superior training, their better logistics, their more flexible command structure, their higher morale, would tear through Soviet formations like a knife through paper. He believes the Red Army, for all its size and sacrifice, is a blunt instrument that wins through mass and attrition. And he believes that in a straight fight, quality would triumph over quantity. The moment passes, the parade continues, tanks keep rolling, troops keep marching, but something fundamental has shifted. Everyone who witnessed the exchange understands that the alliance binding America, Britain, and the Soviet Union is already breaking apart. The war against Hitler is over. The Cold War has begun. For the rest of the day, the interactions between Allied commanders remain cordial but cool. Zhukov doesn't challenge Patton again. Patton doesn't press his advantage. They both understand that what happened on that reviewing stand wasn't really about artillery ranges or tactics. It was about the future, about whether Soviet expansion would go unchecked, about whether the West would stand firm or accommodate, about whether two fundamentally opposed systems could coexist or whether conflict was inevitable. In the days after the parade, Patton's comments and behavior became even more aggressive. He speaks openly to reporters about the Soviet threat. He questions denazification policies, arguing that Germany needs to be rebuilt quickly to serve as a bulwark against communism. He suggests recruiting Wehrmacht veterans into American-led forces to fight the Soviets. His statements are not just politically unacceptable, they're explosive. They threaten the entire framework of post-war planning. By late September, Eisenhower had had enough. On September 28, 1945, Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army. Officially, it's because of his statements about denazification and his refusal to remove former Nazi party members from administrative positions in Bavaria. The real reason is that Patton has become a diplomatic liability. His anti-Soviet statements are making it impossible to maintain even the pretense of Allied cooperation. Truman and Eisenhower are trying to work with Stalin on Germany's occupation, on the United Nations, and on post-war stability. Patton is undermining all of it. Patton is devastated. The Third Army is his creation, his pride, his legacy. He's led these men across Europe. They've won victories that will be studied for generations. And now he's being pushed aside for telling what he sees as the truth. He writes in his diary that speaking truth to power has cost him everything. He tells friends he expects never to command troops again. At 60, his career is effectively over, but Patton's warnings aren't forgotten. Churchill, now out of power but still influential, begins speaking more openly about the Soviet threat. His Iron Curtain speech in March 1946 will echo many of Patton's concerns. American intelligence services, initially focused on rebuilding, start paying more attention to Soviet military capabilities and intentions. The policy of accommodation with Stalin gradually shifts toward containment. On December 9, 1945, just 3 months after the Berlin confrontation, Patton was seriously injured in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. His vehicle, a 1938 Cadillac limousine, collides with an American military truck. Patton is paralyzed from the neck down. For 12 days, he lingers in a hospital in Heidelberg, unable to move, struggling with pain and the knowledge that he'll never walk again, never ride a horse, never command troops. On December 21, 1945, he died from complications including a pulmonary embolism and congestive heart failure. He's 60 years old. The circumstances of Patton's death spawned conspiracy theories that persist to this day. Some believe Soviet agents orchestrated the accident to silence their most vocal American critic. Others suspect OSS involvement, claiming American intelligence wanted Patton removed before he could cause more diplomatic damage. Most historians believe it was simply a tragic accident, a random collision that claimed one of America's greatest military commanders at the moment when his experience and insight might have been most valuable. Zhukov's fate is different, but no less dramatic. In the years immediately after the war, Stalin grows increasingly paranoid about Zhukov's popularity and independence. The marshal who saved Moscow and captured Berlin is seen as a potential rival, someone whose military prestige rivals Stalin's political power. In 1946, Zhukov was removed from his position as commander of Soviet occupation forces in Germany. He's accused of taking war trophies, of building a cult of personality, of claiming too much credit for Soviet victories. He's demoted and sent to obscure military districts far from Moscow. When Stalin died in 1953, Zhukov returned to prominence. He becomes Minister of Defense under Nikita Khrushchev and plays a crucial role in arresting secret police chief Lavrentiy Beria, but his independent streak remains. When Khrushchev fears Zhukov's influence is growing too strong, the marshal is again sidelined, forced into retirement in 1957. He lived until 1974, writing his memoirs, receiving state honours, but never again wielding real power. The man who defeated Hitler ends his days as a symbol, not a decision-maker. The confrontation on that September day in 1945 was more than a verbal sparring match between two proud commanders. It was a preview of the 46-year struggle ahead. Patton represented one vision of how to handle Soviet expansion: meet it with strength, challenge it directly, refuse to accommodate tyranny even when the costs are high. His approach was aggressive, confrontational and uncompromising. He believed that weakness invited aggression, that Stalin respected only force, and that delaying confrontation would make the eventual conflict more costly. Zhukov represented a different reality: the immense power of the Soviet military-industrial complex, the willingness to accept casualties that Western societies found unthinkable, the ruthlessness required to survive in Stalin's system. He wasn't boasting when he described Soviet tactics. He was stating facts. The Red Army had defeated the Wehrmacht by being tougher, more brutal, and more willing to sacrifice than its enemies. That capability didn't disappear when Germany surrendered. History suggests both men were right in their own way. Patton was correct that Soviet expansionism was a threat that would require decades to contain. His warning that future conflict would take 6 years and cost us 6 million lives was, if anything, optimistic. The Cold War lasted nearly half a century. It cost tens of millions of lives in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and countless proxy conflicts. It brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation multiple times. The policy of immediate confrontation that Patton advocated might have prevented some of that, or it might have triggered World War III while atomic weapons were still relatively limited. Zhukov was correct that the Soviet Union's military capability was formidable and that underestimating it would be foolish. Despite Patton's confidence, fighting the Red Army in 1945 would have been catastrophic. Soviet forces outnumbered Western allies in Europe by substantial margins. They controlled territory from Berlin to Vladivostok. American troops were exhausted and desperate to go home. The public had no appetite for another war. And unlike Germany, which was already defeated when Patton proposed action, the Soviet Union was at the height of its military power, bloodied, experienced, and occupying defensive positions. The doctrine that eventually emerged, containment, was a compromise between these visions. The West didn't launch Patton's preventive war, but neither did it accommodate Soviet expansion. The strategy was to resist Soviet influence without triggering direct conflict, to compete economically and politically while avoiding military catastrophe. It was patient, expensive, and frustrating, but it worked. The Soviet Union eventually collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, not from external military defeat. Standing on that reviewing stand in Berlin, neither Patton nor Zhukov could have predicted the exact shape of what was coming, but they both understood that the alliance that defeated Hitler was dying. They both saw that the next great conflict would pit West against East, democracy against communism, the Atlantic Alliance against the Soviet bloc. The parade around them, the show of unity, the coordinated march of Allied troops, all of it was already obsolete. The real parade was the one nobody wanted to see, the long, grinding competition that would define the second half of the 20th century. What did Zhukov say when Patton threatened to fight the Soviets? In that specific moment he said nothing. Stunned silence was his response. But in the broader sense, Zhukov's entire career answered Patton's challenge. The Soviet marshal's tactics, his willingness to accept casualties, his ruthless efficiency, all of it demonstrated that defeating the Red Army would have been far harder than Patton imagined, and Patton's career answered Zhukov's confidence with equal force. American military power, technology, training, and tactical flexibility created a conventional deterrent that kept Soviet forces from pushing further west despite their numerical superiority. The confrontation between these two warriors wasn't the last word on American-Soviet relations, but it was one of the first honest exchanges. No diplomacy, no careful language, no political considerations. Just two soldiers, two philosophies, two visions of how the post-war world should work. Patton believed in striking first and striking hard. Zhukov believed in absorbing punishment and grinding forward until victory was inevitable. Both approaches defined their nation's military traditions. Both shaped the Cold War that followed. The ruins of Berlin stretched around them that September day. Two cities really are already dividing. The western sectors, where Americans, British and French established democratic governance. The eastern sector, where the Soviets imposed control. Within 3 years, the Berlin blockade would test whether the West would abandon the city. Within 16 years, a wall would divide it physically. The city where Patton and Zhukov sat side by side would become the symbol of a divided world. The place where the Cold War was most visible, most dangerous, most likely to turn hot. So what's the legacy of that moment? What does it tell us about leadership, about military power, about the nature of conflict? First, it reminds us that wars don't really end, they transform. The guns stopped firing in May 1945, but the struggle for Europe's future continued immediately. Leaders like Patton, who understood this early, were marginalized as warmongers. But within 2 years, the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan adopted much of Patton's strategic thinking about Soviet containment, just without the military confrontation he advocated. Second, it shows that personal relationships between leaders matter less than the systems they represent. Eisenhower and Zhukov genuinely liked each other, exchanged gifts, and maintained correspondence for years. But their personal friendship couldn't bridge the gap between capitalism and communism, between democracy and totalitarianism. Patton and Zhukov had no such friendship, just mutual respect between warriors. But that respect couldn't prevent the Cold War either. The conflict was structural, not personal. Third, it demonstrates that military confidence must be tempered by political reality. Patton was probably right that the Third Army could have defeated Soviet forces in Germany in 1945, but he was wrong to think that such a victory would have solved the larger problem. The Soviet Union was vast, populous, and ideologically committed. Defeating one army wouldn't have ended Soviet power, it would have started a war of attrition that America wasn't prepared to fight, and the American people wouldn't support. The story of Patton and Zhukov in Berlin is ultimately a story about truth and timing. Patton spoke the truth about Soviet intentions when nobody wanted to hear it. He paid with his career and perhaps, if conspiracy theories hold any weight, with his life. Zhukov embodied the truth about Soviet military capability, the brutal efficiency that came from suffering, sacrifice, and Stalin's ruthless system. He paid by becoming a threat to Stalin and spending years sidelined despite his achievements. Both men were warriors in an age that suddenly didn't need warriors anymore. The world wanted diplomats, administrators, and politicians who could manage peace. But peace proved elusive. Within 5 years of their Berlin confrontation, Americans were fighting communists in Korea. Within a decade, nuclear weapons made direct confrontation between superpowers too dangerous to contemplate. The world Patton and Zhukov represented, where great armies clashed and victory went to the bold, was being replaced by a world of proxies, deterrence, and mutually assured destruction. If you could have asked Patton in that moment what he thought would happen, he probably have told you that America would eventually have to fight the Soviets, that delaying would make it worse, and that 1945 was the time to act. He'd have been frustrated that political leaders lacked the courage he thought necessary. And he'd have been partially right. The confrontation came, just not in the form he expected. If you could have asked Zhukov what he thought, he might have told you that the capitalist powers would eventually attack the Soviet Union, that eternal vigilance was required, and that Soviet sacrifices in the war had earned them security and respect. He'd have been preparing for the next war even as he celebrated victory in the last one. And he'd have been partially right. The confrontation came, though it remained cold rather than hot. The truth is that both men saw clearly what was coming, but neither could prevent it or shape it according to his vision. They were creatures of the war that just ended, not architects of the peace that never quite arrived. Their confrontation in Berlin was a moment of brutal honesty in a world that was learning to lie diplomatically. And maybe that's why it still resonates. In an age of careful political language and diplomatic niceties, there's something compelling about two warriors telling each other exactly what they thought. Consequences be damned. So what do you think? Was Patton right that the West should have confronted Stalin immediately in 1945, or was the policy of containment that eventually developed the wiser choice? Could Patton's Third Army really have defeated Soviet forces in 6 weeks, or would such an attempt have triggered a catastrophe? And does that moment in Berlin, when Patton silenced Zhukov with a single sentence about 700 yards, tell us something about American military culture that's still relevant today? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this story of two warriors at the dawn of the Cold War resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that shaped history. And if you're interested in more Cold War history, check out our video on the Berlin airlift, when Stalin blockaded the city and Truman had to decide whether to abandon it or risk war to save it. The world Patton and Zhukov confronted in 1945 was just beginning. Its echoes still shape our world today.